He transformed the guitar and served as an inspiration. Millions and fundamentally transformed rock music itself. Yet behind Eddie Van Halen's charismatic smile and intricate passages that few rivals ever knew about, he admired six guitarists, contended with, and at times found it intolerable. What caused this concealed tension among the legends? Furthermore, why did some of rock's most renowned figures find themselves on Eddie's covert list of disapproval? Join us as we discover the six guitarists most disliked by Eddie Van Halen. Number 6. Eric Clapton. Prior to the eruption and the thunderous crowds, an adolescent Eddie Van Halen was seated in his Pasadena bedroom, accompanied by an inexpensive guitar and a well-used collection of Cream records. Night after night, he placed the stylus on crossroads, endeavoring to capture every nuance of its progression. In an intense, fiery solo performed on Eric Clapton's Les Paul. Clapton was not merely an influence. He was the rationale behind Eddie's decision to acquire the instrument. He once stated to Guitar World, "Clapton was my primary influence. I used to sit there for hours attempting to discern what he was doing. I would perform that performance on Crossroads, note for note. He was regarded as divine by me." In those initial years, Eddie showed little concern about reputation, vocal quality, or songwriting skills. He sought to comprehend the factors that contributed to Clapton's performance. Experience vitality. The phrasing, the sustain, and the pauses defined his musical essence. However, time transforms all things. By the late 1970s, Eddie Van Halen accomplished what even Clapton had not. He revolutionized the electric guitar. At the moment when the eruption occurred, producing a sound as if it originated from another realm. His two-handed striking, harmonic squeals, and dive explosions revolutionized guitar technique. Abruptly, this reserved young individual for Pasadena emerged as the future of rock. Supporters revered him, but not all individuals expressed approval. The veteran musicians Eddie once revered regarded with skepticism. In the year 1980, when Clapton he was queried about Van Halen, and his response left Eddie astonished. Clapton stated, "He possesses considerable technical skill, yet I do not perceive much soul." It was a flippant remark, yet it was profoundly impactful. For Eddie, it was a profoundly distressing experience. The gentleman who had previously influenced his manner now dismisses his music as mechanical. Subsequently, he admitted, "It somewhat distressed me. I gained all my knowledge from him. I was not attempting to outmaneuver him. I was motivated by his example. To learn that he did not, it was as though my actions truly affected me deeply." Eddie never responded in kind. He is never insulted Clapton in interviews. However, friends state that he silently grappled with the disappointment and how unusual it was to experience rejection by his idol. A portion of the conflict originated from philosophical differences. Clapton's guitar playing was characterized by restraint, embodying a blues-inspired style in which tone and cadence narrated the tale. Eddie's was centered on themes of freedom, distortion, feedback, and courageous innovation. In a sense, they embodied two distinct eras, Clapton exemplifying the music of the 60s, Eddie the voice of tomorrow. Yet, despite the suffering, the admiration remains unwavering, diminished in appearance. In 1995, Eddie acknowledged Clapton's tone on Crossroads that remains inaccessible. "I am not concerned with what anyone else may say. That is unadulterated emotion. You cannot simulate that." The two leaders ultimately convened in Los Angeles in the mid-1980s. Eddie was filled with anticipation, akin to a devoted devotee encountering their idol for the first time. Clapton maintained politeness while remaining somewhat reserved. They discussed instruments, tone, and amplifiers, but not regarding emotions. Subsequently, Eddie informed a colleague, "He is merely a man. I believe I experienced affection. The mystique overshadowed the individual." That moment transformed him. It was when Eddie ceased perceiving legends as deities and began viewing them as human beings, intelligent yet inherently imperfect. Subsequently, when inquired about Clapton's statements still troubled by it, Eddie chuckled quietly. No, perhaps he did not understand. Perhaps I did not obtain him as well. We originate from disparate worlds, sir. That statement encapsulated them flawlessly. Two guitar deities from various realms. Clapton depicted the scene with blues and shadows. Eddie illuminated the heavens with vibrant neon hues. Following Eddie's death in 2020, Clapton is said to have spoken appreciatively of him in private, describing him as a genuine innovator, although he never issued a public statement. However, supporters familiar with his story understood the significance of the gesture. By that time, Eddie had long since come to terms with it. In 2001, he stated to Guitar World, "If Clapton had not existed, I would not exist either. Whatever he may think of me does not alter that fact." By the end, Eddie's admiration remained intact. It had reached maturity. "I will always be pursuing the sound I heard on those vintage Cream records," he once stated. That is the location where the fire originated. Eddie's sorrow over Clapton was profound, but his subsequent rivalry intensified more fiercely. This occasion, it was not disappointment. It was unequivocal competition. Two guitars deities, a singular platform, and no space for concession. What occurs when Eddie Van Halen advances directly toward head of the malevolent wizard of the Stratocaster? Number 5. Ritchie Blackmore. There are few experiences more anxiety-inducing for a young guitarist. Few experiences compare to meeting a hero, particularly when that idol is Ritchie Blackmore, the enigmatic and unpredictable musical genius. Positioned behind Deep Purple and Rainbow. For a young Eddie Van Halen, Blackmore was not merely an ordinary rock icon. He was a visionary of sound. Eddie would undertake research. Burn and Highway Star, played meticulously note for note, continuously rehearsed until his fingertips bled. He admired the meticulous precision of Blackmore's passages, the sharpness of his distortion, and that haunting quality, a sense of theatricality that pervaded each passage. To Eddie, Ritchie was among the few individuals who could render a guitar sound genuinely vibrant. When Van Halen's inaugural album achieved widespread acclaim and commercial success, 1978, Eddie unexpectedly found himself standing alongside the man he had grown up with, idolizing. He was no longer a youth with a Stratocaster copy in his bedroom. He was an equal, a chart-topping guitarist, redefining the conventions of rock. However, the dream was rapidly diminished when he ultimately encountered one of his deities. In a 1982 interview with guitar player Jazz Obrecht, Eddie recounted their initial encounter. "He simply gazed at me," Eddie stated, "would not greet or acknowledge at all. I was deeply devastated. I thought to myself, wow, I truly admired this guy my entire life, and he simply dismissed me. That silence resonated more profoundly than any other insult." Eddie was not arrogant. He was notably sincere and approachable, a person who could discussions regarding transmission and pickup wiring for extended periods. He collaborated effortlessly with anyone and readily expressed amusement. What remained with him regarding Ritchie, characterized by a sense of detachment, a vacant gaze, and an absence of warmth. The complete lack of rapport. Years later, Eddie referenced it. Once more, people such as Joe Perry and Ritchie Blackmore simply dismissed me. With their senses, he informed Rock and Roll Garage, would not extend greetings, would not please demonstrate kindness. There is nothing. I'm not inclined in that manner. The phrase, "the shaft with their eyes," encapsulated this sentiment. Achieved the impact flawlessly. Eddie had just performed Eruption, a guitar solo that erupted with intensity, technique, and compelled every rock musician to reevaluate the boundaries of what was achievable. Nevertheless, his protagonists, the men whose posters had previously adorned his wall, regarded him with a certain expression, more frigid than antagonism, dismissiveness. A portion of it was attributable to Ritchie's character. Blackmore was notoriously challenging, even in his interactions with his own bandmates. His enigmatic aura relied upon the distance. And when he was queried several years later for his opinion of Van Halen, his response appeared to be both a compliment and a critique. "He's a fine player," said Blackmore, "but I believe he executes an excessive number of notes." Fans debated this point for years. Is it jealousy or traditional elitism? In fact, it exposed a more profound division within the schism between two periods of rock guitar development. Blackmore's style was characterized by classical phrasing and restraint. Each nuance and vibrato was intentionally applied. Eddie's performance was characterized by fluidity, dynamism, and a sense of freedom. In which location Ritchie designed control, while Eddie exemplified liberation. It was not precisely a dispute, but rather a matter of generational differences. Impasse. Eddie embodied the image of a new movement, representing the Californian innovators who reconfigured their amps, their own custom instruments, and sought tones that had never been heard before. Blackmore was the final individual. Of the meticulous British hard rock purists, his fretwork grounded in precision and structural clarity. Nevertheless, Eddie never transformed that frigid encounter into a sense of bitterness. In a 1995 Guitar World interview, he reflected with understanding. I was likely overly sensitive at that time. Perhaps he was reserved or unsure of what to articulate. However, man, I highly admired that individual during my formative years. Continue to do so. Over time, even Ritchie's stance became more lenient. Within 2008, he informed Classic Rock magazine, Eddie Van Halen introduced something new. I am unable to refute that. His actions with the whammy bar and the striking techniques, it was quite astute. He discovered his own voice. It was a moment of recognition, the very aspiration Eddie once cherished. Their paths diverged. However, they remained united. Subject to influence, Blackmore transitioned into medieval melodies and Renaissance compositions. Harmonies with Blackmore's Night, emphasizing refinement over intensity. Eddie remained perpetually restless, consistently modifying his instruments and tone circuits in pursuit of excellence, the sound that no other individual could detect. And he indeed did. By the time the world was deprived of Eddie Van Halen in 2020, even the most dedicated Blackmore enthusiasts had come to embrace what their idol ultimately acknowledged. He was exceptional. He discovered something that everyone else was attempting to discover. The words arrived decades later, but for Eddie Van Halen, they were sufficient. However, Eddie would shortly encounter a distinct form of rejection, characterized by a loud, boastful demeanor and an abundance of attitude. Number 4. Joe Perry in 1978. Van Halen was the emerging new force, a thunderstorm advancing across rock skyline, primal, electrifying, and impossible to overlook. The band's debut album had only recently begun to make an impact on the airwaves, and Eddie Van Halen, scarcely 23 years old, was still the aspiring young musician for Pasadena, striving to demonstrate his place among the legendary guitarists. Each night on tour, he performed solos with such intensity as if his very life depended upon it. However, beyond the amplifiers and flashing lights, and something subtly pierced him, the frigid indifference of the man he had grown up with. Admirers of musicians, such as Joe Perry of Aerosmith, Eddie once informed Jazz Obrecht during a 1982 guitar player interview regarding the experience of that early tour. Individuals, such as Joe Perry, he recounted, simply provide me with the shaft while they observe, would not extend greetings, would not please demonstrate kindness. There is nothing. I am not inclined in that manner. Imagine being the youthful prodigy on the road, engaging with all your resources repeatedly night after night, and upon ultimately encountering an obstacle into the champions whose posters adorned your wall, they do not even glance in your direction. No, I do not agree. No is might. Simply that cold, inscrutable gaze. He perceived that Perry and individuals similar to Ritchie Blackmore perceived him as a significant menace. In that same interview, he stated it plainly. They would not make an effort to assist anyone because they would feel threatened. It was not merely bitterness. It was an authentic assessment of the generational transition occurring in the late 1970s. Eddie's style is characterized by its fluidity, fearlessness, and rooted in innovation. They have redefined the landscape of electric guitar performance. The veteran ensemble embodied blues and confidence. The modern one emphasized agility and accuracy, and exploratory sonic practices. Perry, a foundational figure in 70s heavy rock, originated from an institution characterized by riff-driven rhythms and an unrefined attitude. His tone was heavy and sluggish, and filled with decadence, the soundtrack of cigarette smoke and backstage disorder. Eddie's, in comparison, it was lightning and stereo. His two-handed tapping, along with his utilization of harmonics and tremolo bar dives, and his preoccupation with tone shaping rendered his sound innovative and nearly extraterrestrial. For certain veterans, it did not seem like an evolution, but rather an invasion. Eddie did not publicly confront Perry, nor did he do so at any point. Reacted aggressively, but privately, he could not dismiss how peculiar it seemed to be regarded as an outsider by those very individuals who had inspired him. He was not seeking mentorship, merely a handshake, a gesture of mutual respect. Instead, he departed with a composed determination. If he refused to open the door, instead, he would construct a new one. Nevertheless, Eddie's spirit was not inclined toward harboring grudges. He had cherished the guitar excessively for that. He once stated, "I am indifferent about whether I am participating in a holiday event. In lounge, I take pleasure in playing." That statement fully encapsulates his spirit. He participated in the capacity for the pure excitement of creation, rather than politics or approval. Music, in his view, was an expression of pleasure. Furthermore, if others failed to perceive that, it was indeed their loss. Ironically, many years later, Joe Perry would entirely reverse his position. Time possesses the capacity to diminish ego and leave exclusively the truth. In 2013, during an interview reported by Van Halen News Desk, Perry looked back with genuine admiration. Eddie's performance was truly exceptional. He took all he had heard and applied his own distinctive mark to it. I thought, "Oh my God, this is excellent." He revolutionized guitar playing. Perry characterized his experience upon listening to Van Halen's debut album for the first time, thoroughly captivated by the music he was experiencing. "I was profoundly affected." "Away," he acknowledged. "I continued to revisit the process in order to understand those subtle techniques and details. Sound, the form of energy. It was simply so unlike anything he had experienced before." For Eddie, that delayed respect arrived too late. Late in erasing the pain of those early years, but it conveyed profound significance regarding his influence. Despite this, those who initially dismissed him ultimately had to recognize what he had accomplished, not merely for the instrument, specifically the guitar itself. And yet, even at the height of his prominence, he never condescended in his speech to anyone. The same contrition that characterized his early disappointment remained with him. Upon inquiry regarding athletes from the preceding generation, Eddie consistently spoke with warmth. "They inspire me to want to play," he stated. "I owe my presence here to them." By the time Eddie gained Joe Perry's respect, he had already ceased seeking anyone's approbation. However, the subsequent confrontation was not of a personal nature. It was intellectual. What transpires when Eddie Van Halen encounters the MIT-educated prodigy who did you establish Boston's excellence from a subterranean laboratory? Number 3. Tom Scholz. It was intended to be merely another sunlit afternoon performance in the late 1970s, featuring Van Halen and Boston sharing the program, both riding the forefront of America's emerging rock movement. The audience murmured excitedly, beverages in hand, as the stage resonating with feedback. Eddie Van Halen had just completed his solo, primal and fearless. Imbued with vitality, the audience continued to bellow loudly as Tom Scholz took the stage. Upcoming. Subsequently, an unusual event occurred. Eddie later mentioned, Tom Scholz from Boston as well, recalled, "We performed immediately prior to their session, although I cannot recall the location, and I completed my solo. And then all things considered suddenly, he performs my solo. It was quite unusual as it occurred during the daytime. I was standing on stage, and the entire audience was observing me as if to inquire, 'What is this? How are you doing?' I was intoxicated. I became angered. The image remained with him. Certain enthusiasts, some believed Scholz was offering a tribute. Others considered his actions to be imitative. To Eddie, It had appeared as a loss of identity rather than merely a theft of melodies. That vexation intensified due to Scholl's the backstage area was not particularly heated. Eddie characterized him plainly. He never visits. It does not greet nor perform any action. Simply withdraws discreetly, then proceeds onto the stage to perform, and then vanishes subsequently. The combination of imitation and detachment was quite jarring. Eddie held in high regard confidence, but silence read as conceit. Tom Scholz, in contrast, was not attempting to preempt the announcement. He was the complete antithesis of Eddie in nearly every aspect, a meticulous engineer with an individual holding a master's degree in mechanical engineering from MIT, who produced Boston's debut album in his underground laboratory. He designed his own equipment, meticulously calibrated each frequency, and developed the Rockman amplifier system that defined the lustrous tone of arena rock. Where Eddie is portrayed by instinct, with Scholz's judgments refined through scientific analysis. Their worlds intersected as distinctly as oil and water. Eddie embodied anarchy and impulsiveness. Scholz represented structure and discipline. One person relied on improvisation. The other depended on established formulas. Nevertheless, both pursued the identical objective, the ideal sound. Eddie alluded to this frustration in a subtle manner. 1980 interview with guitar player. There were individuals already attempting to perform the actions I was engaged in, such as the tapping and the runs, along with all related gestures. Even individuals who has existed for an extended period. It is flattering, but I must say, perhaps it is time to develop a new approach. Your own initiative. He did not explicitly mention Scholz, but it was widely understood to be a reference. Roadies discussed it in hushed tones for several months. To Eddie, originality was not merely an option. It was an imperative. He constructed his Frankenstrat manually, welding pickups and sawing bodies, and amplifying his efforts until he discovered his voice. Observing an individual emulate that sound, it resembled observing an unfamiliar individual donning your visage. There exists a distinction between inspiration and duplication. He informed Guitar World several years later. You may find inspiration in the example set by an individual. Playing is how we all begin. However, if you do not progress, you're just following in the footsteps of another individual shadow. Scholz has never publicly commented on the matter. He was renowned for his privacy, favoring soldering irons over microphones. Nevertheless, his reticent demeanor clashed organically with Eddie's outgoing demeanor, beer in hand. Crew members stated that Scholz would allocate hours behind the scenes fine-tuning decibel levels while Eddie engaged with fans and exchanged guitar advice. Two intellectuals, united by the same passion, yet residing on distinct planes. Critics appreciated drawing comparisons between them, but they were separated philosophically by emotion. If one overanalyzes, Eddie once remarked, one risks losing one's composure. Music is not governed by formulas. It is a matter of intuition. That statement encapsulated the reason why Scholz's meticulousness occasionally unsettled him. Because, for Eddie, imperfection embodied the essence of enchantment. Nevertheless, mutual respect ultimately emerged. In a rare Boston Globe interview from the early 80s, Scholz acknowledged, he has got imagination. You are unable to impart that knowledge. And Eddie, decades later, reciprocated the gesture. The individual constructed 50% of the materials he employed. That is impressive. I hold great respect for all individuals. Who engages in direct involvement. Years later, when inquired whether it caused any concern him that others had replicated his style, Eddie smiled. If they do, good for them. However, they will never resemble my voice. No individual is capable of replicating the sound. Anyone else, not particularly. However, while Eddie was acquiring knowledge to dwell amidst imitation, another, colder storm awaited. More precise and significantly more individualized. Number 2, Rick Derringer is the year 1978. Van Halen is experiencing a rapid increase. The debut album has been released, the audience is exuberant, and Eddie Van Halen's instrument is redefining the standards of rock music. Each night is charged with an electrifying energy. Appreciate the emergence of the future taking shape. Subsequently, the evening progresses with Rick Derringer performing as the opening act. Derringer is a seasoned veteran, a distinguished figure with a notable history, whom Eddie has long admired since childhood. But what transpires subsequently profoundly unsettles Eddie. Following the conclusion of the performance, Eddie proceeds to enter the bar, still energized from the exhilaration. He locates Derringer and states, "Hello, Rick. I was raised by you. How might you accomplish this? I am indifferent as to whether you utilize the technique. Do not perform my melody." Eddie's remarks convey three distinct emotions simultaneously: esteem, treachery, and a plea for dignity. He does not harbor anger regarding Derringer's use of striking. He is angered that he replicated his solo, note for note, melody for melody, in front of the same audience. Inspiration constitutes a singular concept. Replication is an additional process. The following evening, Derringer repeats the action under similar circumstances. Notes, maintaining consistent inflection, even concluding his performance with "You Really Got Me," a song previously performed by Van Halen, transformed into a definitive anthem. Eddie's forbearance suddenly exhausts. He states directly to Derringer, "If you are proceeding to continue doing so, you are not opening for us." And with that, Derringer is removed from the tour. For Eddie, this was not a matter of conceit. It pertained to the concept of identity. Van Halen continued to establish its position in history, and Eddie's distinctive sound, characterized by tapping techniques and tone, remained influential. Volcanic energy was the core of it. Observing it imitate so plainly, particularly when performed by an individual he regarded it with respect, yet it seemed akin to larceny. Years later, he acknowledged, "It is problematic, you know, as a result of I had previously adopted some of his techniques." The criticism did not stem from mere imitation, but from observing a hero cross that boundary. In order to comprehend the reasons behind its significant impact, you must understand how Eddie perceived music. His father, Jan Van Halen, a jazz musician, instructed him early, "If you perform another artist's composition, make it your own." Eddie adhered to this principle. Regulation. Each time he retrieved the guitar, he was pursuing something that had not been heard before. Previously, when an individual replicated his solo precisely, it was not merely about the notes. It was regarding the act of removing the essence from them. By the year 1979, every guitarist in America was attempting to emulate his manner of expression. Eruption had completely shattered all barriers. Magazines fixated on his so-called secret technique, prompting players to decelerate their turntables, merely to examine his digits. However, Derringer was not a mere youth in a garage. He was a colleague, a professional, and this distinguished it. Behind the scenes, the ensemble was unable to cease conversing. Regarding this matter, David Lee Roth, consistently the entertainer, humorously remarked, "We do not perform in cover bands, particularly not our own." However, for Eddie, it was not amusing. It served as an admonition. As his fame increased, the number of persons grew accordingly, would attempt to acquire portions of what he had constructed. And yet, even amidst wrath, Eddie managed to handle it with uncommon composure. No public insults or backstage altercations. A subtle yet resolute boundary. He drew a line in the sand, not from arrogance, but from a sense of pride. He had exerted excessive effort, so that someone else may don it with his approval. Throughout the years, that intensity diminished into viewpoint. By the 1990s, Eddie was able to reflect on it with amusement. "It is amusing at present," he remarked, "but I was quite heated. I was a child, and I had labored so diligently for that sound." Then, you hear an individual, "Should I simply perform it directly on stage?" You respond, "No way." Rick Derringer neither denied the story nor confessed to it. Upon inquiry regarding Eddie, he merely stated, "He is an exceptional player. No one is able to surpass him." Perhaps that was his manner of seeking reconciliation. By the early 1980s, Eddie had progressed onward developing new guitars, creating innovative tones, and pursuing novel ideas. The Derringer incident became merely another moment in a career characterized by innovation, but it imparted to him a single enduring truth: achieving greatness entails being imitated, and safeguarding originality is not arrogance. It is a matter of survival. Many years later, when inquired about imitators, Eddie smiled and stated, "You may replicate the licks, but not the essence." Spirit. And that is the essence of music, the spirit. He had encountered imitators, adversaries, and even heroes who drew upon his passion. However, the subsequent one was not focused on imitation. It pertained to the act of intimidation. What transpired when Eddie Van Halen encountered the individual who previously dominated the guitar industry? Number 1. Randy Rhoads. In the early 1980s, two influential guitarist prodigies occupied the forefront of rock's tumult, notably Eddie Van Halen and Randy Rhoads. Both individuals were young, both were transforming guitar playing, and both were subject to relentless comparison. For Eddie, such comparisons struck a profound chord. What initially commenced as reverence swiftly evolved into antagonism and possibly subdued resentment. Eddie's sentiments toward Rhoads were not developed based solely on hatred. They were fundamentally driven by pride, competition, and the dread of being overshadowed. In Randy Rhoads, Reflections of a Guitar Icon, archive recordings feature Eddie contemplating the emergence of a teenage guitarist. His words were pointed, imbued with both sincerity and defensiveness. He was one guitarist who was honest, in any case. Because he stated that he did everything, he learned it from me. He demonstrated proficiency. However, I do not. I genuinely believe he has not accomplished anything that I have not already done. There is nothing incorrect with it. I have emulated the work of others, That is characteristic of Eddie, serving both as a compliment and an acknowledgement of his usual style. Challenge. He recognized Rhoads' talent, but promptly established a clear boundary. You have gained knowledge from me. It was not so much arrogance as it was Eddie asserting his authorship of the guitar revolution he initiated. Tapping, dive explosives, and harmonic squeals, all the techniques characteristic of the 80s guitar style, became abruptly pervasive. And a number of those echoes emanated from Randy's fingertips. Rhoads, on the other hand, had arrived from a markedly different background. He received classical training, demonstrated discipline, and maintained a nearly scholarly approach to music. Where Eddie embodied instinct and passion, Randy exemplified precision and technique. Together, they embodied the two extremes of contemporary guitar playing: pandemonium and control. Supporters unable to resist drawing comparisons between them, and that persistent struggle manifested itself in every aspect. Magazine headline and behind-the-scenes dialogue. Ozzy Osbourne, who collaborated with Randy, subsequently expressed astonishment in response to Eddie's comments. In an interview with Rolling Stone, Ozzy stated, I recently heard that Eddie Van Halen claimed he taught Randy all his techniques, but he did not. To whom it may concern, be truthful. Randy did not have a positive remark to make about Eddie. Perhaps they experienced a disagreement, out or whatever, but they were competitors. That term, competitors, accurately describes the situation. It was not open warfare. Rather, it was a form of icy competition. Both individuals recognized each other's exceptional brilliance. Both were aware comparisons proved unavoidable. And in a scene driven by ego, identity, and innovation, neither desired to be perceived as second best. There is even an account that Rhoads' guitar technician once affixed a photograph of Eddie Van Halen to the underside of Randy's wah pedal. Each time Rhoads proceeded, he was, quite literally, actively stomping on Eddie. It was partly humorous and partly symbolic. It was amusing, yet also conveying a message. Rhoads aspired to establish his own legacy, independent of comparisons. But Eddie's name accompanied him wherever he went. Beneath Eddie's frustration resided a fundamentally human element: vulnerability. He was not merely a guitar legend. He was an individual who transformed the very vernacular of rock. guitar and was unexpectedly hearing that language spoken back to him by another individual. When he stated he was honest, nonetheless, it nearly resembled a sigh, a subtle acknowledgement that imitation, at the very least, when acknowledged, it served as a gesture of deference. And yet, there was more than mere conceit in Eddie's words. There was a sense of wounded dignity. The guitar culture in the late 70s and the early 80s were marked by intense competition. Each participant was endeavoring to advance boundaries in order to achieve greater speed, increased volume, and enhanced innovation. Eddie had constructed his rebuilding reputation from the ground up, developing tonal qualities, establishing the Brown sound, and leading pioneering efforts techniques that elicited astonishment to observe those ideas reflected by another participant, regardless of how remarkably accomplished, evoking complex and profound emotions. Tragically, the tale of Randy Rhoads concluded all too soon. Shortly, his death in a 1982 plane accident halted that rivalry indefinitely. He never received the opportunity to transcend comparisons or to observe how his legacy might have intersected or reconciled with Eddie in subsequent years. For Eddie, that loss likely introduced an additional dimension of complexity. How does one address and reconcile emotions concerning an individual who has passed away? You are unable to do so. The contest remains lingering in recollection, unresolved and everlasting. In subsequent interviews, Eddie seldom revisited Rhoads directly, but when he did so, his tone became more subdued. The wound had healed, giving way to silent introspection. Perhaps he recognized that rivalry and respect were two aspects of the same coin, that the reason that the significance lay in the fact that Rhoads possessed exceptional skill. Upon reflection, it is possible that Eddie do not harbor any negative feelings towards Randy Rhoads. Perhaps he recognized too much of himself in him, and that reflection was both admiration and unease in comparable proportions. Thank you for your attention. Please like and comment. Please subscribe. Additionally, please review another engaging video by tapping on the link provided. Your display. Farewell until we meet again.